Okay, I'm going to start. Thank you, everyone, and welcome back. I'll be moderating this session today. I'm very delighted to welcome Dr. Kanta Kumari. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Okay, sorry. I'm very delighted to welcome Dr. Kanta Kumari from the World Bank. She is our keynote speaker for the webinar on climate change and human migration. Dr. Kumari works for the World Bank as a lead environmental specialist and also regional climate change coordinator in the Africa. She is a leading expert on climate adaptation and resilience and works on climate policy, strategy, and knowledge management. Most importantly, she is, of course, well known to all of us and all of you because of her leading role in publishing the flagship report from the World Bank titled Groundswell, Preparing for Internal Climate Migration, and another report that Turned Down the Heat. She has extensive working experience working in the Asia, Africa, Latin America, and in the Caribbean islands. And she has a doctorate degree from the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom. Yes, with extensive experience and huge profile, it will take me more time to introduce Dr. Kanta Kumari, but I will now welcome Dr. Kanta to give her keynote speech today. And after that, I will take questions from the participants. I would request you, if you have any question, please write down in the Q&A box. It is now over to you, Dr. Kanta Kumari. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bias, for the introduction. And thank you also for the invitation to participate in this virtual event on climate change and human migration. It's a real pleasure to have this conversation with all of you. And I know you've started the session some time back, and I was fortunate enough to listen to some of the really interesting and compelling discussion. What I would like to do here is really talk about the issue related to climate change, looking more in the context of framing this issue in the decades to come. But it's always good to take a step back, and I know you talked a lot about this issue of disasters and displacements. And what we do know is, as was discussed this morning, that this is really unfolding and escalating around the world. So we are seeing more and more situations where people are displaced, and sometimes those are becoming more frequent, and sometimes, you know, they are sort of becoming more intense. And there's different kinds of information that is emerging, and IDMC provided you with some of those data points and results. And we know that this is, you know, an issue that is really touching across the world, you know, in the developing countries for sure. But I think even in the context of Europe, there's interesting, you know, work being done to sort of track how these extreme events have led to a higher scale of mobility, even within the countries in that region. And what I think is also interesting is that in the IDMC's annual report that they put out in the last few years, that at least I have followed this discussion, that the increasing number of those displacements are due to weather and climate related events, more the hydrometeorological. And this is a data point from 2019, where they recorded 33.4 million new displacements, and of which about almost 25 million were due to disasters, which were weather related, storms, floods, cyclones, and what have you. But at the same time, we know that not all places are equal, and you can see a huge variation in the spread of the countries where you have these displacements. What I think is very interesting is that they look at it from the conflict and sort of the disaster perspective. Just a quick point here, the World Bank is having, and IMF are having their annual meetings in the following week. And the bank has just released a new report that looks at poverty as an issue, which is really fundamental and core to the World Bank's mission of eradicating poverty and creating shared and boosting the prosperity amongst the bottom 40%. And what we've come away with is that they're really the three C's that are undermining the poverty context. And this is, near term, it's been the COVID, but it's climate and conflicts. And there is really strong relationships among some of these parameters. And I just wanted to put that out there that, that we've been set back on some of our poverty goals because of these three C's. But for the conversation today, I'd really like to put forward these two propositions. And the first one is that climate change is emerging as a potent driver of migration. And it's critical that we really begin to understand the issue, the scale, the trajectory, projecting into the future decades. And really, more importantly, it always hits home where we're on the ground and understanding the spatial dimensions of this phenomena. The second is that we quite know now that climate migration will be a reality. But I think we also want to recognize that it doesn't have to be a crisis and that we really need to act urgently and act now. And the only way we can do this is to have far-sighted strategies and policies that will allow us to go beyond the crisis hopping. So, but I just want to take a step back, and I know you've talked a lot about this climate disaster displacement this morning, and I also heard about the interesting conversation about climate and climate change. This is a very simple picture that just shows you the data point from the pre-industrial going up to the current period, and you can see that the global mean temperature has been systematically increasing. This is a record-breaking industry. The last 5 years have been the hottest ever, and the last 15 years, the last 10 hottest years have been since 2005. So we know that we are getting into a world that is, definitely warmer than where we were, and even within our own generations, we begin to see that. But what is also happening alongside with it is that the climate change is amplifying some of the stresses on people, on ecosystems and economy. We know that, the hydrological cycle and the way that precipitation patterns are in countries have really been different, but the rate and pace of some of these changes in terms of seasonality, annual and decadal contexts are also changing. And therefore, with it, some of the availability of water per capita is also being amplified by climate change. Recognizing, I think that there are a lot of baseline issues that need to be addressed, but the seasonality and the climate variability and change certainly do put additional stress. More specifically, I think the science on this is quite clear that agricultural yields, whether it's in crops like rice and wheat and others, are really being impacted by climate change. And this certainly you can see that has an immediate consequence on food security. So we have situations where food security is reaching all-time high. Not all of it attributable to climate change, but climate change is an amplifying factor. In this day and age, we currently have about 220 million people who are food insecure in Africa. And if you include the moderately food insecure, that goes up to 600 million. That's really a travesty. And the fact that climate change could amplify some of this, not just in terms of the cropping patterns, but really the end-to-end value chain in terms of disruptions of markets, disruptions of transportation and access to markets is important part of looking at the whole equation. And then we have, at a high level, that whole coastal dilemma. We heard a lot about Bangladesh this morning, and it's really one of the low-lying countries and particularly climate vulnerable. And in that context, globally as well, we find that humans have had a fascination to be on the coastal areas because that's where the resources were, that was where they could carve out their livelihoods. But now we find that there is this push and pull dilemma. We all know that, with the melting of ice in Greenland and some of it in Antarctica, with the thermal expansion and melting of glaciers, that the sea level is rising. And this is going to be compounded by storm surge and will be amplified. And where you find countries have coastlines, you find that more or less at least 30% of the population lives in those areas. So something else to keep in mind. And when we begin to put this together, and the scientists have been very clear, we are sort of really sitting at the crossroads of how we want to chart out our future. We can continue on that business as usual emission pathways, which leads us to certain types of stresses, or we can try to reduce our emissions and come down to the 2 degrees. I'm not sure about the 1.5 anymore, but the science is unequivocal that with that increased warming comes certain impacts, be they heat waves, be they the crop declines I just talked about, flooding patterns or water stress. So what we do know, I think the IPCC 1.5C special report was that the impacts will accelerate beyond that 2 degrees Celsius guardrail. And you can see that the kinds of impacts we could avoid if we keep to below the 2 degree Celsius target are quite immense. You could avoid heat impacts by 89% and crop declines by almost 40%. Similarly, flooding and water stress would be reduced significantly, and therefore put less pressure on ecosystems, not amplify the vulnerabilities that are there, and have people making decisions on how to carve out those livelihoods. But I think what is even more important, and the science is evolving on this, is what does it mean when you have these impacts? They kind of have this cascading effects. So while you have the forcing that is happening and you have physical changes and biochemical changes in the globe as a whole, this ultimately reach home and impact humans and human systems. So whether you are in a climate sensitive sector, like in agriculture and carving out, agriculture produce from a rain-fed system that is now being impacted, or whether you are an urban person who is now subject to more extreme events and flooding, partly because of poor infrastructure design and drainage systems, but you have these recurrent floods, like we saw in Cyclone Idai in Africa, right? So we had it hitting Mozambique and Zambia and Zimbabwe, and people were really impacted. More than 150,000 displaced, I believe, and they were hardly recovering from that. And you have another tropical cyclone, Kenneth, and these are becoming more frequent and intense. But then this is where I think when it begins to hit the human systems, you have this decisions being made on moving or not moving, as we heard this morning as well. But those decisions are being made, and they're not made solely on climate change, as you all know. So with that sort of broad brush on sort of the climate change synopsis, I just wanted to shift gear a little bit to the whole question about climate migration. And I think you're all very learned and of course very informed. I've heard from the conversation this morning, but it's always useful to sort of, think about what the climate migrant is. And I don't attempt to define that. But I always like to go back to what I think the IOM put out in terms of environmental migrants. And I think what they have done is really quite useful, because if you take that phrase that they have and you break it down, I think it really provides us a sense of what we think we're trying to look for. So they kind of say environmental migrants are the person or group of persons. And I think that's really coming down, from sort of where we want the bottom, and saying there's persons or groups that are moving, and they're moving for compelling reasons, whether they are sudden onsets, whether they are due to sudden events. We talked about floods, we talked about cyclones, and whether they are displaced, or whether you're talking about progressive changes in the environment, whether it's the land degradation, whether it's the impounding drought that is hitting them, or the water stress. and that in fact are adversely affecting their lives or their living conditions. And I think this again comes back to their livelihood options, comes back to the habitability of that area. If it's particularly low lying and going to be sort of um, you know, dealing with that sea level rise or the storm surges frequently, it does affect their habitability. And the chances are, even if they don't get up and move to the cities, there is a kind of recession, receding that needs to happen, and that they are then obliged to leave their habitual homes. Not that everybody does it, but there are those components that do. Or whether they do it voluntarily or whether they do it as a compelling. And this again could be something temporarily. We all will talk about evacuation, but it could also be something that's more protracted. And whether they move within their country or abroad. And I think this is really important because a large and huge number, 3/4 of the people who actually move within the context of their own countries. And we know that, and that's the UN data out there, versus those who move abroad. And even when they move abroad, they tend to move within the region and regional context. So, I mean, that's, I think, the definition that I like, because I think it breaks it down and it gives you entry points of looking at it with a lens at different multiple things. But we all know that movement is not driven by any one factor, and it's really multifaceted and driven by multiple factors on social, economic, environment, policy context. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But at the end of the day, it does affect very ordinary people who would be adversely impacted and who are making decisions, as we said, not driven by one thing, but driven by the composite of factors. But there are increasing number of stories that do reflect that mobility due to climate-driven factors. In our work on the Groundswell Report, which I will touch on in a bit, we did interviews, and I think we were careful in our interviews, as I heard earlier, not to solicit predetermined responses. But I think that the issue is definitely one that people talk about very liberally, particularly if they know that and their livelihoods are in a climate sensitive context. So all of this, I think, is to really say, and I think to build on the very good conversation this morning, that we really need to understand the issue. I think there's really compelling research that has been done, which shows the multi aspects we need to look at in individual case studies. But it would be fair to say that there are an increasing number of cases, stories, media articles, but also good research that shows that there is a mobility, a movement that is happening as a consequence of some of the environmental factors that are being amplified by climate change. And we need to understand that issue. And we would really, when we conceived at the World Bank, the Groundswell Report that I had the honor to lead, it was really because we knew that from a development perspective, climate was touching and impacting every sector that we were working on. It was affecting people, affecting economies. But then what we were really interested to look at, and I was particularly compelled to look at, was what was the impact on the human dimension? How was it really affecting people and on the ground? And how would it actually unfold into the future? So we conceived this report working with leading institutions, scientists from the Potsdam Institute, demographers from the CUNY Institute of Demographic Research, and the Columbia University as geographers, and brought together for the first time a way in which we could help to understand this issue using data sets and big data sets that we use to really unfold those possible, plausible scenarios and trajectories that we'll come to in a bit. But it was really driven by the motivation to inform policymakers better and to plan and prepare for a future that is really already on the edge, as you say, of a new climate normal. We are locked into a certain level of warming, and climate is changing, and whether we get to the new climate normal in 2030, 2040, or 2050, the likelihood of that is increasing. And so we really need to begin to plan and prepare. But it was not just about the numbers. The numbers are important to convey the sense of urgency to address an issue, and we can come back to that. but it was also to understand from a spatial dimension, from a geographic dimension, what are those areas of greatest vulnerability. So with that, you could really then undertake constructive dialogue and drive that informed policy and action, both at the national level, at the global level, and even at the subnational level, I might add. So what do? We really put this spotlight on the nexus of climate, migration, and development. And we really started out by looking at internal climate migration because we really believe that that's really where a large part of that mobility happens. On top of it, I think it's where we really feel that development issues need to be addressed. And we looked at it so within countries. We also looked at the slow onset climate change that would really lead to protracted shifts in the way spatial populations would play out. And in that context, we look at water stress, we look at drops in crop productivity, and sea level rise compounded by storm surge. And we looked at it in the context of up to 2050, which is medium term in some ways, but it's where you can influence planning and policy processes in an effective way. And what did we do? We really developed a model which is scenario based. You know, I heard a lot about conversations this morning. There's no number that's right, and we weren't trying to put a number out, although everybody loves numbers. But it's really trying to come up with a plausible set of scenarios that could play out depending on how we approach the issue. So we started out with what we call a pessimistic or a reference scenario. And what this essentially is a scenario which is coupling high emissions with unequal development. We didn't reinvent these data sets. These are the ones that come from IPCC and IAEA. We have these modeling processes that have already laid out these development pathways and emission scenarios. And we also brought in the demographics in terms of the global population, gridded population of the world that would also look forward to 2050. But that pessimistic scenario, we did two things. We then altered it to look at where you could have continued high emissions, but coupled with more inclusive development. And then we looked at the more climate friendly, which is low emissions, but continued unequal development. This really then provides us a sensitivity against the different scenarios and to make some kind of comparison. And what did we do in terms of data? We brought in the global climate models. We used the demographic models, and we used the climate impact models. I think this is where there is some difference. We did not use sort of the standard variables of just temperature and precipitation. We drew on the state of the art of the ISIMIP models, which are basically crop water models, simulation models that have been run by scientists looking at the impact in a gridded way. So we brought these data sets together at the size of a grid cell of 14 kilometers. And we modeled those. And essentially then what we also did was we looked at using a gravity-based model, looked at how spatial populations would change due to the climate context. So we compare a baseline scenario where there is no climate impacts at all, which is what population demographic models do. They do them based on urbanization, on other levels of attractiveness, on education, on technology, but they don't really explicitly model for climate dimensions. Then we brought in these climate impacts to understand then how that spatial shift would turn out in a geographic context based on these kinds of parameters. These results of the 14 kilometer were then aggregated up to the national level. And we also further went and contextualized these results through discussions, through a search of the literature to validate it. I might add that in developing these models, we of course did a backcasting from 1990 to 2000 and then to 2010 to really calibrate the models for this climate signal, and then we project them forward. That's for the geeks who want to know how we did it. And I'm really pleased to see that Dr. Brian Jones, who was one of our lead modelers, will be in conversation with us in the next session. So hold your questions on that. What did we find? We found that, yes, there is this big number of 143 million across the 3 regions, which really constitutes about 3% of the population. But more importantly, I think what we found was there was variation across the regions, not surprisingly, because it really ultimately reflects some of the vulnerabilities and capacities to cope within the countries. So sub-Saharan Africa comes up with 86 million, South Asia with 40, and Latin America with 17. We then did actually deeper dives at a sub-regional level for each. In East Africa, in Central America, we did Mexico and Central America. In South Asia, we left it intact, and Bangladesh was one of, and in each one, we had a case study, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, and Mexico. But I think what's important in these results is to recognize that when you compare across the 3 scenarios, there is a common feature that as you move from the pessimistic scenario down to the inclusive and climate friendly, the numbers begin to get less. I mean, they all vary across the regions and even across the countries that we look. But clearly, I think the message here is that, you need concrete climate action, but you also need development action, which can really reduce those numbers significantly and sometimes as much as 80%. But the trajectory is another important dimension if we want to bring this into policy and planning at scale. And what we find is that the numbers that we have in the early part of 2020s begin to accelerate over time. And this is not surprising when you think about some of the climate impacts that are being amplified, whether it's on water stress, crop, or sea level. But it doesn't come out the same way, and the trajectory is different per region. And when we did it at the country level, more nuances come out. But essentially, you see that South Asia, and then Bangladesh is a big part of that, that increase could be as much as 6-fold. In East Africa, it's 3-fold, and then you have Mexico. So, but the message that we want to convey from this is that we have those bands of uncertainty, by the way, the white areas. But the message is that, it's how we are going to act now in the next 5 years or 10 years and what kinds of actions we take that are really going to determine that trajectory. And it's that window of opportunity for early action that is really critical. But those are about the numbers and the scale, and they don't really allow people to look at what is actionable. The additional, and I think the real contribution from Groundswell comes from this spatial analysis. And this spatial analysis is definitely using models. Here is where we interface with the great research that is done, whether it's the longitudinal studies or whether it's the agent-based studies or any other case studies, which we try to pull where the literature exists, but where I think we need to complement our research, is on those hotspots. Not every piece of geography or land is going to behave the same way. It's really going to be responsive to the climate signals and that local context. But what we did find is that there was this climate in and climate out migration hotspots that begin to increase in spread and intensify and multiply between 2030 and 2050. Clearly, the areas of climate out migration tend to be on the coast, but not just in the coast. There's other factors that could have been driven by water stress or changes in crop productivity. And there are other areas which are more attractive. And here is a case based on Lake Victoria and based countries and the larger. What I think is very interesting is to see this emergence, and this is where policymakers and land use planners can begin to identify what are some of the options that they need to pursue. And oftentimes we find that there will be this greater movement towards urban areas. It also means that those urban areas need to have a certain anticipatory plan on how we cope with this, but there are other coping measures which can also look at adapting in place and having more inclusive development. So this spatial dimension is extremely important. I might add here that in the context of the Lake Victoria Basin, we are currently conducting additional deep dives where we have drill down on this model that we developed in Groundswell, but added additional layers. Layers like ecosystem productivity, which we didn't include in the original model. We have brought in floods as an extreme event, and we've layered in conflict from the ECLED data. But what I think is really interesting is to see that even at that more granular level, we took it from 15 kilometers down to 1 kilometer and aggregated, that the persistence of some of these factors even emerges there. Now, we did that deeper dive to have more deeper and meaningful and actionable conversation with policymakers. All of this to say that I think it's always work that is iterative, that needs to drive deeper, and it needs to be contextualized further. But I think the issue is so important that we all need to think about bringing the best of science and research to bear on policy. I won't go into the detail, but I think what we did beyond the sort of continental, regional, and then we focus on certain case studies was to draw out the nuances even further. And I think Ethiopia is an interesting country, important in the region, obviously, where it has seen a lot of mobility based on droughts and other reasons, of course. But I think you would see in the bottom left-hand corner something that I think is really important to take note of. You have a country that is has a lot of people engaged in agriculture and has practiced rain-fed agriculture in the Addis area and in the highlands. And you find that that area is going to have a dampening of a population growth, partly driven by the change in precipitation patterns and climate change, and an out-migration to some of the lowland areas. This is quite contrasting to what you would have assumed as business as usual growth. And not that this may be totally correct, but I think it gives you pause and brings in certain questions that we are digging deeper to understand how to inform policy better. What I think is also interesting is the trajectory of change above that you see. So in Ethiopia, it's interesting because you have the pessimistic scenario having slightly less climate migrants than a climate friendly scenario. And you might say, wow, what's that about? That's really driven by the fact that the global climate models show an anomaly, particularly in the northeastern area of Africa, in the Horn, where under high emissions, there is a prediction of more precipitation. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And you can see the huge uncertainty belt around it. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to have precision before we action. I think the uncertainty of some of these models also means that policymakers have to plan for a broader realm of realities. And that is an important part of the conversation in itself. So I just wanted to give you a flavor of some of the depth of the research and the product that is both driving the conversation and trying to inform policy context. And I think all of this is really for us to go from sort of chaos and turbulence to something that really allows us to be more prepared, recognizing that the reality is here. So I want to come back to the propositions, right? So climate change is a potent driver of migration. Now, I mean, one can always debate how much and where and whether one believes in it. But what we try to show is that the magnitude and trajectory of climate migrants under the continued pessimistic scenario would increase and would escalate, and that the spread and intensity of those migration hotspots, be they climate in or out migration, would increase. It's really important that we pay attention to both the in and out, because it has different implications for planning. It has different implications for the people who are involved in this situation. But what we consistently came across was that the poorest and the vulnerable areas would be hardest hit. And it's because of their vulnerability and the fragility and the need to address some of those concerns, whether they're countries, whether they're localities. But we also wanted to underscore that, you know, these we see to be conservative estimates, focusing on a select set of slow onsets. We know that the extreme events and the rapid onsets do bring about much more scale of displacement, and we're not putting that aside. What we're looking at was a longer term trend. But the reality also is that we know that we are locked into a certain level of warming, but At the same time, we're not saying that these scenarios are cast in stone. And that's, I think, the message that we really want to convey on how we use that information. So when we say that if some of these scenarios are set in stone, some of these scenarios we are locked into and there's some level of mobility, then, but we also want to recognize that if we act now, we could avoid this sort of crisis response, but begin to anticipate, begin to plan in that longer term context. One message that I think is unequivocal is really how climate change would be impacting things at scale, whether it's the water stress that gets amplified, or the crops, or the sea level, and the imperative to really cut greenhouse gases is on the top of the line. It really is, and the IPCC report and other reports have underscored how we can sort of avoid some of those impacts. But the second is about really, and we heard a lot about it this morning, is embedding the resilience into the development planning and putting some kind of a lens to that migration issue, which I think oftentimes from development organizations, we are very fixated on looking at the development, and sometimes that issue may not have got a lot of attention, but I think it's to pay attention to it. But it's really then about pursuing good, inclusive, sustainable development first and foremost, because there is really a development deficit and a vulnerability that is going to make someone more likely to be pushed out. But there is also things that we can do, which is sort of the adapt in place and helping people to make sure that they are able to deal with the drought better, and that there are social safety nets, and that we are able to step in and provide them with the alternative livelihoods as needed, so that they really become more resilient. But at the same time, there are situations when you would have to enable that migration to happen, because it's part of the adaptation strategy. And I'm reminded here, in particularly working in Africa, in the Sahelian countries, we have 20 million Sahelian pastoralists who I think traditionally have always migrated and moved in a transhumance way. But what is happening now with climate change is that the seasonality patterns are changing. So the rain doesn't arrive on time. And when the rain doesn't arrive on time, you take your herd and you start moving to the next area. But you're moving into areas which were traditionally agricultural areas, where the herders would come in after the crops had been harvested. And now the crops are not harvested, and you have this whole situation where you have a certain amount of conflict. So should you stop that migration? No, and facilitate it, but we need to come up with a way in which the herders have water for their livestock, but they don't damage the crops that are still not being harvested. But you create these strategies that will facilitate the movement, which is key, and that has to happen. But have new ideas and new ways. So for example, in that particular context, there is now the use of satellite data to understand where maybe some of the water areas, of course, ground truth with people on the ground, using mobile technology to then convey that message, managing the process. So there are a lot of interesting solutions, and I think we need to use them across the board. But the third is, I think, recognizing that in some of these contexts, some areas may simply not be habitable in the future. Due particularly in the case of sea level rise, but it could also be heat stress and other things. And here you really need to support the communities in a systematic way, not that they have to be done under distress and on their own wits, but really an increasing level of support and planning and inclusiveness in the decision making, like the bank and others were engaged in Sao Tome and Principe, where clearly they were able to show, using satellite data, using historical data to show the communities that the water had been coming in and receding into their communities, and that there was a need to have a planned relocation. Communities who are very much tied to those areas could not imagine that they had to move inwards. But I think the data convinced them, and they knew that some of these changes were happening, and there was work to relocate the communities further inwards, not that far, but inwards. But, you bring that inclusiveness. And one of the things is interesting in Sao Tome, the communities, especially the elders, felt very tied to the sea, and they felt that if they didn't have this vision of the sea and able to look at it, it would really cause some psychological challenges. And in that planned relocation, there was a sensitivity to have a bus that would actually take them, each day or when needed to view the sea. It may sound very mundane, but these simple things through inclusive, targeted solutions that really hear the lived experience of communities is important. So how do we do that and support it in a way that doesn't disenfranchise them? But I think the third takeaway we had was this is not, a perfect science. I mean, it's something that is evolving and unfolding at a pace that we can't even sometimes keep up with as researchers. But I think we need to really invest more. We need to invest at the global level, but we also need to invest in the bottom up case studies that we heard so compellingly from Bangladesh on this morning, because I think that's really how we sort of bring the top and bottom down to have a better informed decision make. But the reality is we really, really have to act and act now. And that window of opportunity, I think we are getting to that new climate normal. And I was interesting to hear Salimul, I think was very good, saying that 2020, we're already witnessing these things, right? And I think we need to act. I'm going to end now, but I didn't want to sort of not touch on that policy landscape that exists, at the global and at the national context. And there are lots of frameworks, agreements, and processes. I wouldn't say a lot, but there's an emerging set of these. And the Global Compact for Migration, after sort of much discussion and negotiations, it's interesting that climate change is reflected there, and the need to look at that as sort of some of one of the underlying drivers for migration. The internal displacement guidelines have been there for a while, and I think they provide a lot of a normative framework for us to look at. The Sendai framework looks at it more from a disaster perspective, and I think that is important. But the Kampala Convention, in which covers Africa, I think is one particular one that actually is one that recognizes disasters, recognizes natural hazards and climate change within that as a common framework that can help with the internally displaced, but it also obviously talks about cross-border. But within the national context, I mean, there's varying levels of domestication of these global and regional processes. It really depends where the country is on the sort of curve towards recognizing this issue. But within the context of internal migration and IDPs in particular, there is a lot that can be done within the national and local development plans, as well as the disaster risk management strategies. The NDCs, which really sort of encapsulate the country's agreements and commitments towards the Paris Agreement, I think is another instrument where I think you're increasingly seeing some reference to migration. When we did the Groundswell, I think we looked it up and it was about maybe 30 odd countries that referenced it. And it was largely in the context of migration as an adaptation strategy. But I think increasingly some have also called that migration because of failed adaptation, right? So just to put this into context that there are multiple entry points. A point that I didn't have on this slide, but which I feel very strongly about is the need for our actors to come together, first at the global level. We have the development actors, we have the humanitarian actors, we have the disaster response community, and some of us have been working in silos. I think the good news is that I think there's an increasing recognition for our communities to come together. I know that the World Bank has a memorandum with both UNHCR and IOM, and this work is now, discussed a lot more, even through actionable projects and programs that we're working on, and that could also happen at the national level. So with that, I really want to draw to a close where I am and stop sharing and come back to you. But thank you all for this chance to share with you some of my thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kanta Kumari, for your interesting presentation. Really, it was full of statistics, graphs, and some real-world numbers. Now I will take some quick questions from the audience. I mean, it's already there. I will read it out. First, from Linda Salman, where is this work published, or is it available online so we can dig into individual locations?
Yes, this is published, and I can put the link on in a little bit. It's, I think if you just went and Googled and you said Groundswell World Bank, you'll find that link. And you'll be able to see the report, the full report and the overview as well.
Yes, the next question is from Mazharul Islam to you. It's about, he said, many people in coastal areas like in Bangladesh displaced internally on a temporary basis. However, they remain in most cases underreported. How they could be counted? Or is there any particular framework or model used by the World Bank to include those internally displaced people into the financial services to increase their resilience to climate change adaptation? So how to calculate or count the temporarily displaced people? Do you have any modular framework, and how to include them in the financial model?
No, thank you very much for that question. Maybe just to answer that question in two parts, Mazaru, right? The first is that in the context of the case study that we did for Bangladesh, where we applied this model that I talked about bringing in the climate impacts and demographic data, that was not applied from a bottom-up level. It was applied to see from a spatial context and a temporal context, what are those areas where people would tend to move as a consequence of some of these climate drivers. What we do find is that Bangladesh, obviously because of the low-lying nature of the area, would have people moving away from that. And it's interesting that when you take sea level compounded by storm surge, when you could have, 4% of the area being inundated on the coastal and then 8% by 2050, which means that people would likely be moving. I think the point you say, and I don't have a sense of how it could be best done at the national level. I think there was a good conversation with some very prestigious researchers from Bangladesh that might be worth posing the question to. But what I think the point you raised that we kind of referred to it in the report a little bit in the context of Bangladesh, you have a converse situation where people could be staying there even though they shouldn't. And this is partly driven by the fact that you may have one member of the family working either in the cities or sometimes even abroad, who is sending back remittances. And so the family tends to remain there. And there is evidence, and there was some research done by the World Bank, where we find that families who are left are subject to health conditions because they're living in saline issues, and they have a lot of manifestations of health issues. So you have a situation where you're not moving because you are getting something from remittances, but technically you shouldn't be there. And I think that is a different kind of entrapment. I'm not answering your question, but I'm just saying that counting them, but also looking at where people shouldn't be there because of other reasons. Notwithstanding, I heard the research of Biswajit, I think it was this morning, who recognizes that, of course, there are people who choose to stay for a multitude of other reasons.
Yes, thank you. We have 5 more questions, but in 10, 12 more minutes. So next question is from Dr. Bishwajit Murlik, and he thanked you for your presentation. And did you consider the temporality of displacement in your variable? If yes, have you observed how the duration of translocality may differ for future internal migrants across the countries? So about temporary displacement again, do you have this variable in your model? And if yes, and have you observed something related to duration of translocality?
We did not look at temporary movements. what our models sought to do was to look at protracted uh, climate migration in the sense of movements of spatial movements of people who would happen, which would happen for sure, in the sense that you are having climate impacts that will push the person to the next grid cell and the next grid cell. So it's not a situation that they are moving temporarily. I think that's the kind of data that you would have from the sort of disaster displacement, where you have obviously temporary and then people can be moving back. And I think some of the best research that is been done then, I'm not privy to all of it, the Hurricane Katrina that happened in Louisiana. Now, I think that's one area where I know the Brown University and other researchers have been really following a certain set of population to see how they have responded. So initially, obviously, there was a lot of movement, and then they've been monitoring as to who has been going back and why they've been going back and why others haven't gone back. And I think this kind of study over a time series is extremely important to see how can we facilitate that to happen. But it isn't something that we did in our part of the study. Where I think we're coming out from a development perspective is we're saying that if we look ahead and we recognize that some of these areas which will have the push or the pull factor, what is it that we can do from a development perspective in terms of enhancing the resilience, in terms of addressing some of the development deficits? So let me give you an example. So particularly, I think, from the rural areas where we are finding, because of the agriculture context, there are people who could be being pushed out. But at the same time, would they have moved out if they had better water resource management? Would they have moved out if they had drought tolerant varieties? Would they have moved out if they had a more diverse livelihood set of options, which were not so climate sensitive? And I think it then allows, from a development perspective, to address some of the development deficit and help with some of the adapt in place. So we're looking at it ex ante as opposed to ex post. So I think that's really where we're coming out with this particular issue.
Thank you. The next question is from Alistair, and it's about the definition of climate migrant. And also, Alistair mentioned many media articles and reports use the term climate refugees. I mean, what's the difference between them? And do you think it is important to make a distinction between the definitions, and why or why not?
You know, the term climate refugees, I was very interested listening to the in conversation with Dr. Ian. I think people have tried not to use the word climate refugees for a few reasons. One is because of the United Nations Convention that really refers to people who have moved because of persecution, right? Whether it's race, religion, or social affiliation to some group. And bringing climate into that was very difficult because it's difficult to attribute the attributability. We talked about migration here being so multifaceted that you're trying to attribute to climate, and that I think is going to be difficult. Then the second reason, and I'm not going to give you a comprehensive, I'm not so legalistically informed, but the second is I think there is a great hesitation to reopen that convention or even to bring climate into it because it could be watered down. But so I think most people tend not to use it, but I don't think that the term is going to go away because there is a feeling that people will be moving. And you heard about, if you were in the morning session, about the landmark decision on the Kiribati case, where they said that you couldn't move somebody away because of that consequence. So I think it's a term that's going to be bandied around for the next 10 years, and I'm sure it will land somewhere. But right now, I think there is a reluctance from probably various multiple actors not to sort of hang on to the term. I think where we are making progress or where we're trying to push the progress is through the work of the UNFCCC. You had this reference to migration in Cancun, then you had more reflections of it through the Warsaw mechanism. And now I think it's again coming up through the loss and damage agenda. Equally, the Global Compact for Migration, I think getting climate considerations in there was already seen as an entry point to better information, better dialogue with countries. So yes, I think that's probably some of the reasons for the hesitation. I referred to the IOM definition, which I think is very pragmatic, and I think it sets out, as I was trying to do, multiple features that resonate with how climate lens can be applied to that. And I think that's the way we sort of really looked at it.
Yes, thank you. I have a few more questions, 6, but let's try to answer some of them. We can extend 5 more minutes. Is it all right, Dr. Kanta?
Yeah, I'm fine if I can. And you know, I mean, feel free if you have the other panelists who were there for the morning to also chime in. I'm sure they have their views, but I'm happy to take some.
Yeah, I informed them already. So the next question is from John C. Mark. It's about, so good morning. In Africa communities, we face a lot of challenges. How do we take the teaching to the rural areas where we, sorry, probably that's not relevant. Okay, next question is from Vale. It would be great if you could elaborate a bit more on how we could improve the understanding of internal climate migration. Are there any specific research areas that needed to be prioritized?
It's a good question. I mean, my sense is that on the context of internal climate migration, there are some really important areas that we need to look at. Couple that have come up in some of the work we are doing right now. But first one, I think, is on the gender perspective. And what we found in our research when we did the Groundswell, we scourged the literature to find out how does gender really inform, or you know, how does gender factor in this conversation from the literature perspective, and to understand the context in different countries. We found it to be very different in different parts of the world. You know, I'm broadly generalizing now. I think in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, it may still vary between countries, but there were stories about when there is such a situation, girls would tend to be married off earlier, and you know, so I think it's sort of like you're trying to get certain responsibilities. But there was also the converse at that time where girls don't get married. The second is when they will be taken out of school as a first course of action, more so than boys. But in East Asia, you're beginning to see also a feminization of migration. And also in some contexts, in the case of Bangladesh, we found that with the textile industry, that there was some pull and there was some kind of a growth process that was involved. But in Vietnam, there was a feminization through the growth pull, where the government was coming up with certain growth strategies, which enabled women to get that. And then there is the changing power dynamics, which I'm sure you've heard about, with males leaving the household. Sometimes women are empowered. But I also heard some stories, and in fact, this was not stories, literature that was published, I believe, in Bangladesh, where it wasn't always the case. When the male left and the females were left to fend the household and receiving remittances, there was a different level of pressure on these women. And there was struggle between the mother-in-law and the women. So there's various aspects that are both positive, that have given women more opportunities, and in other cases, given women less. And I think, to me, this is a fascinating area of part of the gender development in the context of migration. And I think it needs and merits more research, but which is more also locally sensitive and locally contextualized. The other aspect is on the median age. And we're finding in some of the work that we're doing, and Dr. Brian, who's in your next panel, can elaborate on this, is that the median age works differently in different localities. And sometimes when you have the median age, the higher the age, the less tendency for them to move. But it may not be so stuck on that factor, but I think we need to begin to look at that variable. Because I think it provides different opportunities, but it also means that we need to provide different opportunities to different age groups so that they don't find themselves in these dire straits. So just a couple of context, but there are so many aspects one could look at in terms of even landscapes, drylands being particularly challenged. But I didn't just wanted to put a couple out there for your thought.
Okay, so I will take two more questions. Okay, so there are many. One from Rebecca Parrish is about Rebecca said, I would like to know your thoughts on how the political landscape has changed. You mentioned briefly how there are more collaboration and cross-cutting discussions and how migration is framed, sometimes as a positive adaptation, but sometimes as a failure to adapt. Do you have a feel for how the political narrative has evolved over time?
That's a really important question, and I think it's evolving. Is the word I would use. It's evolving in the face of the reality, right? I think climate is become so visible these days now, that I think one can't shy away from it. But I must say that when I started this research back, and it was in 2011, I was told that I was dealing with the wrong issue, that I was totally out of sync with the issues, the real issues, for two reasons. First, we were focusing on internal climate migration at the heights of what at that time was the European migrant crisis. And I was told that you really have not gotten the right end of the stick. Then we were focusing on the slow onsets, and everybody was talking about Hurricane Maria or some other extreme events. We're talking about huge numbers of people who were being displaced. But I think we kept to the conversation of the fact that we were looking at one aspect, but we really thought that migration and mobility always starts from a locality, and people move because often as a last resort, but they do. And we thought looking at internal migration was important. We also thought there was often this missed opportunity of missed aspect of looking at the slow onsets because they don't capture the media. Sometimes droughts do not get as much attention as floods or tropical cyclones or fires for the matter. But they're the ones that are debilitating over time. And I must say that in this last, 3, 4, 5 years, there has been an evolution. I think there has been a recognition, not least in the Global Compact on Migration, but even in the national context. When we go and have dialogues with governments these days, this isn't a foreign concept to them. They obviously are grappling with a lot of issues, but I think that it has changed. And I think it's changed because I think of the evidence that is out there, the visibility of the evidence, but really also good, strong, rigorous research all around. I think, lots of good case studies, lots of narratives, and I think it's important. Policymakers are listening. And to be fair to them, they do need the evidence. They do need the story, and they need it from their own country or their own region or the context. So I'm really quite hopeful that we are heading in the right direction. I know that the UN processes talk about it more in terms of security, and that's also important because we're talking about security, stability, peace in certain regions, and migration is sort of particularly where it's not sort of adaptive migration is seen as an aberration to those processes.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kanta. We're running out of time. I will take the last question because panelists from our next session are waiting. And of course, our participants. One last question, and to others, I will write it down and I will send a separate email to Dr. Kanta to respond to you. It's about, it's a question from Tilo Majona. If I saw it correctly, China was not included in the report, although being a quickly industrializing country in the world, and of course, quite at risk for climate change. Could you please elaborate on the situation with a few sentences?
That's a perfect end to this question, Bias. We, in fact, did 3 regions in the world when we started out. And we planned to do the whole world at that time, but we were really pioneering a methodology that had never been done. So we didn't have time to do the rest. But we are currently, the good news is, working on the rest of the world, the world that the bank covers anyway. So we are looking at East Asia, we are looking at Middle East and North Africa, and we are looking at Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And that report is currently under works, and we hope to release that around springtime of next year. So that in that way, we do have a global picture that covers all of the regions. I might add that in some of the regions, we may not be applying the methodology as is, clearly not in the Middle East, where there is much more dynamic movement than even migration, but we'll be using a qualitative approach. We'll also be bringing in the small island states using a mix of methods. So stay tuned for the next version of Groundswell. But thank you all for this.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Kanta Kumari. We are really grateful to you for joining us today and for your keynote speech. It was really helpful and enlightening. What we'll do next, of course, we will try to produce a policy brief involving all the speakers from today and our audience. And we'll also plan for a future collaboration. So I will involve you and everyone here in that policy brief writing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bias, and thank you to all of you. I think your questions are so spot on. I will definitely take a closer look at them and come back in any forum that is appropriate advice by Dr. Bias. But I really appreciated this opportunity to share and learn from you. So thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you. Now I would like to invite Dr. Brian Jones to take control over the next panel. Is about panel discussion 2 on climate migration in Latin America and Africa. Let me quickly introduce Dr. Brian Jones. Dr. Brian is an assistant professor at Brush College, and he is also affiliated with the City University of New York. Dr. Brian has a PhD in geography from the University of Colorado in Boulder, and MA in geography from the University of Connecticut. He mostly is interested in exploring the relationship between human population dynamics and climate change in driving human vulnerability to climate-related hazards. And he served as the lead modeler for the World Bank's 2018 flagship report that we have been talking a lot about today. So that's briefly about Dr. Brian, and I would welcome him and the other panelists. Brian, you can introduce others. And yes, it is now to you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Bias. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion. Also, I see Kanta, Dr. Kanta has had to step out, but I want to thank her for her talk as well. That was really enlightening. We've worked together quite a bit, and it's always great to hear from her. And we look forward to, as she pointed out towards the end of the Q&A session, our future work and future collaboration on this important topic. Let me briefly introduce the panel members you'll be hearing from today. We've got a really great group, so I'm excited. I'm going to introduce them in the order they're going to speak. I will briefly discuss actually a bit of the modeling work to begin with for about 10 minutes. Dr. Kanta actually covered quite a bit of the material I have planned, so that's great. It's going to help out in terms of time. And then we will be hearing from Dr. Musanda Mumba in regards to an African case study. She is a Zambian national, currently the head of the UN Environment Programme's Terrestrial Ecosystems team, has been working for over 20 years in environmental and conservation issues globally. Recently, she became the new chair of the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration. She provides, in that role, strategic leadership on forest and climate change, integrated landscape management approaches, policy support for governments globally which includes developing appropriate policy dialogue and strategic direction around terrestrial ecosystems. Similarly, she will be the UN Environment Lead on Terrestrial Ecosystems for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration out until 2030. So we're looking forward to hearing from Dr. Musanda. Next up will be Dr. Jimena Flores Palacio. She is a Bolivian researcher who has expertise on the Pacific Islands. Her main areas of interest are climate change adaptation, climate-induced migration, sustainable development, agriculture and rural development, gender issues, and indigenous knowledge linked to climate change. And she'll focus in particular on that last issue in her discussion of how climate change is influencing migration in the Pacific Island countries. Third up will be Luisa Palon, who will take us back to Latin America. She holds a master's degree in advanced migration studies from the University of Copenhagen and is a researcher at the South American Network for Environmental Migration. She will present a bit of her work that she's been developing with colleagues since 2018, which investigates how the Brazilian official disaster information system captures human mobility. And then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Romola Adola, who will bring us back to Africa, a senior research associate on internally displaced persons in the Refugee Law Initiative at the University of London. She coordinates the Global Engagement Network on Internal Displacement in Africa and is a fellow in the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Her areas of expertise are development-based displacement, law and policy aspects of migration, IDPs, and refugee populations. Okay, with that, I will briefly, actually, I've got to share my screen first. Hold on one moment. Introduce some of the modeling work that I have done on this issue. And I will be referring in large part to the Groundswell report that Dr. Kantakumari was discussing in the previous talk, or towards the end of her previous talk. So some of this will be familiar. That's why I do think it's apt to follow up before we jump into the case studies. As was mentioned, this work was headed by the World Bank in conjunction with partners at Columbia University, as well as the Potsdam Institute and at Baruch College in New York City, where I am based. Okay, so what do we know? A couple of brief points here. And again, this has come up several times during the day, so nothing to really dwell on here. But we do know that internal migration in response to climate change is already happening, and its intensity is expected to increase over time. It's important to note that the degree to which this is occurring is not equally distributed across the globe. There are many countries like Bangladesh that has been discussed, which are being impacted earlier and to a greater degree than others. We also know that migration decisions are not easy to model. They're the result of complex decision processes, and climate acts through many of the other drivers that are part of that process. So modeling can be a significant challenge. Climate change impacts many, many different parts of human livelihoods, be it economic, which is of course a very important component, but also different socioeconomic and demographic components of the normal life course are impacted by climate change. Internal migration itself has the potential to be substantial in terms of its impacts in both sending and receiving areas, which really is the most important reason for attempting to model the phenomena. Even if we know that we're not going to get this right, and we're not going to get it perfectly, the implications of the phenomena are so important that it is really necessary to begin the conversation. Migration at its core is an adaptation strategy. And to the degree to which we can manage it for opportunities and challenges will lead to the best outcomes for everyone involved. So again, as I've mentioned, these are difficult processes to model. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to model migration. Kanta pointed out that the big picture numbers are often fraught with uncertainty, and that is very true. And we knew that going into the Groundswell report. an important point here is thinking about, one, getting the conversation started, and two, what are best practices? How can we begin to actually think about the best ways to model migration such that we actually are providing useful information? And again, the so-called definition of a climate migrant has come up many, many times today, and it's really hard to figure out or put a finger on, because we know that climate very rarely acts on its own as a driver of migration. It acts through other factors, and that really complicates the issue. There are a number of approaches out there, and this field is growing rapidly, which is very encouraging. I won't discuss each of these in the interest of time, but the answer here really is, when you think about what the right approach is, it often has to do with what questions you're asking. Agent-based models are very popular, and they're very, very powerful in terms of their ability to model adaptive human behavior. Right? The agents in these models learn, and they can tell us a lot at the very local level, but they're not necessarily well suited for answering big picture questions over large geographic areas where we're interested in the aggregate population movement. Conversely, gravity models of the type that drove the model in the Groundswell report are better at modeling and anticipating aggregate behavior over large geographic areas, but they're not very good at modeling individual behavior or modeling the household decision-making process. So what did we do in the Groundswell model? I'm going to briefly touch on the methodology here. And I want to mention now that I'm more than happy to take questions on this offline after our panel today. Feel free to email me or get in touch any way you can to discuss if you're interested. Ultimately, it's a top-down, gravity-based approach that we parameterize using a spatial autoregressive model. It is, as Dr. Kanta pointed out, scenario-based. We're not trying to model a single, what we consider to be best projection, but instead we're looking at a lot of what-if questions and attempting to see how the outcomes vary based on different assumptions about what the future looks like. The model itself, what it does is it projects the change in the distribution of the spatial population. And we estimate migration by comparing spatially explicit population change under scenarios that include climate change against a baseline scenario or a reference scenario that does not include climate change, that assumes that there will be no change from the current day moving forward. The model is meant to address longer term, more permanent migration that is the result of slower onset change. And as Dr. Kanta pointed out, we are working on a new application of this model as we speak, which is why I reference several different spatial and temporal resolutions. Over time, we've been improving the spatial and temporal resolution of the model to allow us to do more to investigate certain questions. So a brief demonstration. The way a gravity model works is actually quite simple. You start with a spatial population distribution, and using some, and I won't get into the specifics of that rather horrid looking equation, but using some measure of gravitational potential and some bandwidth around each grid cell, you measure the relative attractiveness of each point in space and create what we call a population potential surface. What this does is tell us how attractive a given location is relative to all other locations. And we use information that is derived by looking at how historic population change has occurred to figure out how people may move in the future to produce a new population distribution. And again, we're doing this with and without climate change to look at how they differ to extract estimates of migration. One thing we do is take advantage of the historic data to look at deviation in what a simple gravity model estimates versus our modified version. Simple gravity models, what you're looking at here is essentially a distance density gradient. Consider the 0 point, the center of a large city, and density, population density, declines as we move away. Simple gravity models will project a smooth gradient, but in the real world, we see variation. And what we are doing in our model is looking at these residuals, these errors, and we are correlating them to drivers of migration that are likely to, say, cause a location to be less attractive than a simple gravity model would suggest, or more attractive. And that's ultimately how we identify a signal on the various climate and non-climate factors that go into our model. I'm going to leave this here for those of you who want to look at it later. This is just a schematic of how the model itself works. Obviously, we don't have time to get into it now. Dr. Kanta pointed out that we are focusing here on slow onset environmental mobility that is generally occurring over longer periods of time within country. We did this using the RCPs and SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways and representative concentration pathways that are used in the global climate community. And we looked at a number of scenarios to see how the outcomes varied. I'll be quick here because this has already been discussed. Essentially, we had a worst case scenario or our pessimistic reference scenario, against which we looked at a scenario that included more positive assumptions regarding socioeconomic development, that is, growth is more inclusive, technology and education are more widely transferred, and you see better socioeconomic outcomes, but the climate scenario remains somewhat negative. And then we have a more climate-friendly scenario where we still assume unequal development, but we assume a future world in which there are more aggressive climate policies that are undertaken internationally. And by holding our pathways constant, we're able to tell whether socioeconomic intervention or climate intervention will do more to change the likelihood of migration. You've seen the big picture numbers. We produced a set of scenarios for each of the 3 regions that we investigated. The range, the total range of migrants by 2050 in the pessimistic scenario ranged from roughly 90 million to up to 143 million. And in the more climate-friendly scenario, we cut that number in half or more than in half. One of the really interesting and I think important pieces of this work was we were able to generate so-called hotspots. What these are, and again, Dr. Kanta referenced these points, are places where our models agreed. Now, we ran an ensemble of models. That is, we used different climate input and different sectoral impact models to try and account for some of the uncertainty on the climate side. And what we found is that in many cases, all of these models agreed on places that were likely to be sending and receiving regions. So what you're looking at here in Central America are places that are likely to be hotspots of in-migration near Mexico City and Guatemala City, for example, and regions that are likely to be net senders, for example, rural regions surrounding Guatemala City and the east coast of Mexico. We did the same thing in East Africa. Hotspots in the Lake Victoria Basin are particularly notable. So what this does is not necessarily solve the problem of, okay, where is this problem going to be and how are we going to deal with it? But instead, it helps us to tell policymakers where to look. And it is our hope that we then undertake a more kind of deep dive, complex look at migration in that region with increasing complexity in the model to then better help us address the big picture policy issues. These are the very same conclusions that were discussed in the last presentation, so I won't go through them line by line. I do want to reiterate the point that this does not have to be a crisis. The degree to which we are prepared for this issue will go a long way towards turning it, taking it from a so-called crisis and turning it into opportunity. Migration in response to environmental factors has been with us for throughout human history. What's different now is perhaps the scope and scale with which we are likely to see it. But that does not mean it needs to be overwhelmingly disruptive. There is a lot we can do if we get ahead of the problem to make this beneficial for those involved in the movement and both sending and receiving regions. As I mentioned, please feel free to get in touch with me if you have any interest in learning more about the methods I briefly discussed here or our work that we're undertaking in partnership with Columbia University PIC and the World Bank. With that, we'll hold questions to the end. I would like to turn it over to Dr. Musanda Mumba, who will begin our journey through Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific Islands. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I just want to really sincerely thank University College London and Dr. Weiss and yourself, Dr. Jones, for this invitation. I'm really honored to be here, and also because I'm an alumni of UCL Geography. Such an honor, and I really just want to say I'm here in Nairobi, where I'm streaming from, and I work I used to work a lot on climate change adaptation related issues, but now more sort of broader terrestrial ecosystems related issues. Brian, just a quick question. How much time do I have?
Roughly 10 minutes.
Okay, yeah, that's good.
Yes.
That's good enough. Yes, brilliant, fantastic. So perhaps I should begin at the point when I just started my career at UN Environment. I used to work for WWF International in different parts, Switzerland, the UK, and then here in the regional office. And then I moved to UNEP in 2008. So when I joined, I was basically hired to try and revamp and help part of the Africa program of our agency to look at intersectionality of climate change adaptation and water issues, because I come from a hydrological background. So I did something that was very interesting and designed a program together with colleagues from the International Organization of Migration, IOM, OCHA, the Office of Humanitarian and Coordination Organization, and also the the Institute for Security Studies, ISS. So we designed a program called Security in Mobility, and it's very great to see your slides, Dr. Jones, talking about the internal migration, but also looking at the spatial mapping of this mobility. Now, the reason we were looking at this work was to really understand how pastoral communities, in particular within the Horn of Africa, move. Now, here we are on a continent whose political boundaries or borders really are not idyllic, especially for pastoral communities who belong on both sides of the camp. For example, you have the Maasai community, both related on the Tanzanian and the Kenyan side. Well, the issue was to really understand why, they were moving, and especially when it was, extreme weather event, even slow onset dynamics like droughts. But what we found out eventually from, particularly at the policy level, and thank you so much for really highlighting that, how this kind of information can inform policymakers, and also because I work in a multilateral institution, we found that governments, and I remember meeting up with a governor of mine who was a member of parliament in the Kenyan government, and I said, so when we talk about pastoralism, what does that conjure to you in your mind in the middle of parliament? And she just instantly, without even thinking about it, said cattle rustling. And I was like, wow, but do you realize that there's been a drought in this area, which has highly variable climate, and there's been an extensive, 2008, 2009 was quite bad. And do you realize that people have had to move for at least 1,000 kilometers to just try and find pasture? But perhaps I want to amplify this conversation to even a much bigger landscape, which is now going to become the actual case study or flagship program for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is the Sahel. Now, the Sahel, all the way from Mauritania, Senegal, coming down, covers a whole sort of dry, arid land bordering the Sahara, all the way through to Djibouti, Eritrea, further south to South Sudan and parts of Uganda. Now, this belt is incredibly interesting and fascinating, one of those spaces where the dynamics of mobility have happened, as you rightly pointed out, Dr. Jones, for millennia, for human history. Now, the issue, therefore, is these extreme climate events that just really shift the dial, and where we begin to see the intersectionality of climate change and levels of degradation, which we've seen a lot of compactness of land or overgrazing of spaces, etc. And this is also driving the Sahara further south. Now, this back to the work of 2008, we also realized within the Horn of Africa, which also makes part of the Sahel, there's been a lot of conflict. So of course, when my girlfriend answered and responded and said small arms or cattle rustling, that was the lens from which the policymakers were looking at it. So the moment they see this movement happening, the first thing they think of, let's curb the small arms issue, let's deal with all of this. And so it's a confrontation and not a conversation around how to deal with issues of resilience or how people are going to adapt or where they're going to be and for how long. And also living and receiving communities and all of that. So what we've been doing over the years as the UN, and particularly UN Environment, together with other different agencies, and I'm sure you've seen for you on social media and Twitter that our sister agency, the World Food Programme, got the Nobel Peace Prize today. So it's all this work that the UN has to do in all these very extreme dynamics, because now, also with high levels of population in specific areas, or just very prohibitive landscapes, people can't move. So there has to be solutions or interim solutions to deal with mobility, especially when we have a situation of conflict. And that's where the challenges also lie in. And this is the same that we've seen around Chad. This is the same that we've seen around the sort of the northern region of Nigeria, also within the Sahel, with extremism, Boko Haram, etc. But then how do we begin to have a conversation? So now what we are also working towards, especially with this UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, is an issue of firstly conserving those landscapes that are really intact. And we know with this pandemic, we've realized that degraded ecosystems are more problematic than healthy ecosystems. So conservation of those landscapes that are intact or in good condition, and they're providing the ecosystem services they are providing. But where degradation has happened, which is a more sort of common story in the Sahel and also parts of the Horn of Africa, is how do we restore these landscapes? So within this terrestrial landscape is how do we engage with communities? Because these people live there anyway, and also having conversation around how they engaged. And we know that in some places where research was either poorly done or misunderstood, and so, like for instance, in northern parts of Kenya, there were resolves to actually grow specific tree species that in the end became, problematic, invasive species. So how do we have the right science to begin to make sure that communities are supported, be it pastoral, otherwise, the sedentary, but also how do we engage with different stakeholders within a multilateral process to bring governments together? For example, the study that we did within the Horn of Africa, we were presenting the outcomes of that study to the East Africa community, because the East Africa community, there's an East Africa Community Parliament and all of that, and that discussion has to happen because there are all these porous borders. So this is where we begin to really have very in-depth conversation, and we depend on a lot of scientific data. And for us as an agency, we host the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. We also host the IPCC, and some of the scientists who are also coming from UCL are involved in some of this work, and also from different institutions around the world. And so we're trying to do as much collaboration as possible, but also finding the right science, because the issue of uncertainty is also huge. And so one of the programs that I was involved in not so long ago was one that was funded by the government of the United Kingdom, DFID, and also the Canadian government, which was a collaborative initiative focusing on adaptation research in Asia and Africa. And you can find it, and I can share the link in the chat there. It's called CARIA, CARIA.net. And it's brilliant work that was done in Asia and also here in Africa to even understand issues that are related to remittances and mobility. And, how does that work? How, for instance, the Somali community in Somalia and then related and connected to the Somali community in London, for example, and the rebuilding of these spaces and also the movement of these pastoral communities. But it's amazing and fascinating scientific results, which you're welcome to read and review on that. But lastly, before I go, I just want to say that I think the conversation around migration is so fundamental and so pivotal, because it is and has been an adaptation strategy for many communities for millennia. I mean, for people from my community, I'm from Zambia originally, and also with my heritage from South Africa, people moved. But now with obviously political complexities and also the dynamics of very extreme weather event, that level of preparedness is also something that we're also trying to see, and also make sure that all the different stakeholders are involved, and also at the very political level, politicians and leaders who are voted in understand the relevance of dialogue and also the relevance of science. That last slide that you shared, Dr. Jones, was very important, because when we've presented a lot of work to member states, we've had to show the before and after. This is what this landscape looked like. This was what the vegetation looked like in the Lake Victoria area. This is the resilience and the work that's happening right now. And over this time scale, this is what's happening. Science is so absolutely fundamental and pivotal. And so in ending, I just want to say with this particular decade, which is aligning with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, it starts 2021, January, all the way to 2030, but we know that landscapes take a long time to recover, but it's very catalytic. We want it to be a movement. We want young people everywhere in the world to be involved. Be it yourselves, you know, restoring the Broads in England, or restoring some landscape in the Amazon, or even in Africa or in Southeast Asia. It's for everyone. And what we've had is a really amazing engagement and conversations happening around the issue of restoration. And so I'm excited to share some resources in there and just really have a discussion at some point later on during this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mumba. That was fantastic. In particular, thank you for highlighting the importance of specific livelihoods within areas that are impacted disproportionately vulnerable, and highlighting the complicated dynamics at work in regions such as the Sahel. Any of the modeling that I discussed earlier, it's absolutely critical if it is to be applied in support of any kind of policy decision, that it is taken with the kind of narrative you provide in mind. Particularly some of the important connections you highlighted, like, for example, that between conservation and migration, as well as conservation and its role in mitigating against conflict. This kind of expertise is just absolutely crucial in terms of any kind of planning applications, and hopefully we can continue to amplify the connection between the scientific community, the modeling community, and those who have the local context and expertise to again try and get out ahead of this issue as much as possible to get the policy correct as we move into the future. So thank you once again. That was wonderful. I would like to turn now to Dr. Jimena Flores Palacio, who will talk a bit about the Pacific Islands.
Just a second, please. Let's see. Okay, just a second. Hello, good morning. Can you see my screen?
We see the Zoom application on your screen at the moment.
Can you see my screen? Oh, sorry.
That's good. You've got it.
Finally. Okay. Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation. It is a real pleasure to be with you. I am speaking from my home country, Bolivia, but today I will focus on the Pacific region, where I spent almost 10 years living, studying, and researching on climate change. So my presentation today tries to answer the question, how does climate change affect migration in the Pacific? When we refer to the Pacific region, we are talking about a vast territory. The Pacific Island countries are made up of 22 island countries and territories that represent an enormous diversity in terms of geography, country sizes, cultures, languages, economies, sociopolitical organizations, and natural resources. We know that climate change is, of course, one of the most serious problems we are facing today, and the Pacific Island countries are particularly vulnerable. Sea level rise, storm surge, severe weather are examples of common risk for homes, families, communities, livelihoods, infrastructure, and national economies. More than 50% of the Pacific population live within 1 kilometers of the shorelines, and the atoll countries are most at risk. So, a number of studies and press reports portray Pacific people, particularly those living in low-lying islands such as Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Marshall Islands, as the victims of global climate change. Catastrophic scenarios like sinking islands and the so-called climate change refugees are narratives that circulate often in scientific publications, media, and political discourses. This image is also extended to the rest of the small islands in the Pacific that have coastal characteristics that make them particularly vulnerable to climate variability and sea level rise. I consider that these global narratives set Pacific communities in unequal power relations as unable to decide their own future. Pacific people's long history of resilience and adaptation in the face of climate change is missing in the majority of these accounts. Far from portraying themselves as helpless or victims of climate change, families and communities have shown tremendous resilience. So, although climate change is affecting people's lives, families are demonstrating great strength and resilience to adapt to these changes. Families are using a mix of traditional and modern technical knowledge. And here I would like to emphasize the importance of traditional knowledge for Pacific communities. People are responding by drawing on their family and village support systems, including customary land tenure entitlements, which is very important in the Pacific. And families, of course, are using population movements as an adaptation strategy. So let's move to migration linked to climate change. Understanding the linkages between climate change and migration, of course, presents many challenges. Over the past decades, there has been a growing recognition that environment and climate change are drivers of migration. However, research remains dispersed and poorly coordinated. Empirical studies are hardly comparable and often use different methodologies that make it difficult to relate them to each other. There is still disagreement and an ongoing debate on the terminology, definitions, and concepts of the linkages between human mobility and climate change and disasters. Moreover, there is a debate on the applicability of these concepts in research and policy design. In the case of the Pacific Island countries, there are some studies on the atoll territories. However, there is little empirical research on the middle-sized Pacific nations, such as Samoa or Tonga, or the bigger Melanesian countries like Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. So, although more research is needed, we can confirm that there is evidence that climate change and disasters are causing population movements, internal and international. Different typologies of mobility patterns have been identified in the Pacific. Internal migration, of course, movements inland to customary lands, migration to urban areas, and overseas migration. Displacement has also occurred following disasters. As we know, human mobility in the context of climate change must be studied along a continuum ranging from totally voluntary migration to totally forced migration. Very few decisions are entirely forced or voluntary, as seen in the cases of the Pacific Island countries. Mobility has not occurred in the extremes, but along a continuum, and it has been linked to the extent of slow and rapid onset events related to climate change. In this table, Campbell and Bedford from universities in New Zealand produced a classification of climate-induced mobility types that are emerging in the Pacific region. They make a distinction between induced and forced mobility, considering both internal and external movements. So they identified three main possibilities for internal movements. The first is to move inland. People remember live basically in the coastal areas. So as a response to climate change or disasters, people move inland and up to nearby locations within the individuals or communities' customary lands. The second is to move to nearby locations that are outside the customary lands. And the third is to move greater distances within their own island or province or further afield. Such movements can be rural or rural-urban migration. Here it's missing external migration. Two possibilities are identified in the Pacific. The first one is migration to other Pacific island countries. There are examples, people from Kiribati moving to Fiji. And then there are other possibilities, migration to other countries. There are special bilateral agreements with countries like Australia, New Zealand, and United States of America. So Dr. Brian Jones mentioned hotspots. So in the Pacific region, of course, there are 5 hotspots that are likely to become source areas of climate change related migrants. The first are urban areas with high population density, urban atolls, cases like the Kiribati, Tuvalu, non-urban atolls, the same, very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and disasters, and then coastal, delta, and riverine communities, and of course, communities prone to drought. In larger Pacific Island countries, climate change may impact international migration and urbanization. However, in small countries, territories, and atolls, the growth of urban areas may increase the pressure for international migration. So migration now and in the short term is likely to follow the current patterns. The voluntary movement of individuals and family is likely to be towards labor market opportunities, including rural-urban migration. However, climate change is likely to increase the demand for both internal and international migration opportunities. Climate change can be the tipping point which results in an individual or family deciding to migrate. In the longer term, the planned relocation of some communities may be required mainly in areas where population density is high. So, for Pacific people, of course, and for all the migrants, migration due to climate change is a very, very sensitive issue. There are many political, economic, cultural, and psychological costs associated with this type of migration. For people in the Pacific, abandoning their original land is very, very painful. Customary land is fundamental for Pacific society, for all the societies, and its value cannot be assessed only in economic terms because of its symbolic and cultural value. Land and sea are the major resources in every Pacific village as the source of food and livelihoods. So less well documented is that family land represents identity, belonging, family history, culture, community, family prestige, and pride, even for migrant communities where name and titles signify location and identity. So, as some conclusions, some ideas, I would like to emphasize that climate change has become an important driver of mobility in the Pacific, in all Pacific countries. However, people's concerns, knowledge, and aspirations continue to be marginalized in national, regional, and global climate policies. So policies and still policy responses to climate change are underpinned by top-down approaches without listening to the people's voices affected by climate change. So I will stop here waiting for your comments and thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fantastic as well. In particular, I want to thank you for drawing attention to the many issues related to just studying climate migration, particularly comparability across studies. I think that's one of the confounding issues when you think about how this issue is treated, for example, in the mainstream media. It's not as simple as just comparing numbers, and that is a problem. In regards to the Pacific Islands, I think many of us are acutely aware that this is a particularly vulnerable part of the world, but are probably less familiar with adaptation strategies in the region, probably even oversimplifying the issue, or we have a tendency to oversimplify it, which probably contributes to the marginalization you mentioned in your final slide. And this is an area I think where we all could do more to better understand. You really hit upon the cultural implications of mobility in the region. And I think that is particularly important in this region when you think about the scope and scale of the issue. And that is a difficult issue to address. So thank you for drawing attention to it. And thank you for your time and effort. Let's turn to Luisa Polon, who will bring us back to Brazil and talk a bit about the Brazilian Official Disaster Information System and human mobility.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this panel and for the invitation. And I'm sure this has been touched upon earlier in the other panels today. But one of the main discussions around the topic of environmental migration is the issue of generating evidence. In other words, to be able to measure how many people are moving in relation to changes in the environment, to disasters, to climate change. So we know that colleagues in some organizations are already working on gathering existing data on disasters, for example, to provide an estimation of how many people have been displaced by certain types of disasters in a specific period. And we found that in the case of Brazil, most of these estimations are based on the data available in the official integrated disaster information system, which since 2012 has been the official channel for public authorities in states and municipalities to report on the occurrence of a disaster and on the impacts on the affected area and community. So myself and my colleagues at Brizama, we decided to dig into this system to investigate how the data collection is structured, and most importantly, to what extent it is actually possible to identify displacement in this data. So I will share my screen with you now. Please let me know if you see my slide.
Yes, we've got them.
Okay, perfect. Do you see the rest of the screen, or do you just see the slides? Do you see it amplified?
It looks like we've just got your slides at this point.
Okay, cool.
So
I was wondering if you were seeing the frame and everything. I guess it's looking fine. All right, so I would like to basically today provide a brief background of how we ended up with this system, what it looks like, and then to finally show you what are the gaps and the opportunities of improvement that we identified in this process. So basically, we can safely say that the years of 2011 and 2012 were a turning point in the timeline of disaster risk management in Brazil. Before 2012, although Brazil had some technical competency to foresee certain weather phenomena and environmental phenomena, the country lacked a centralized institution to integrate the activities and invest in prevention and mitigation. Most governmental measures at that time were limited to then the attenuation of losses and damages in the aftermath of the disasters. But in January 2011, parts of Rio de Janeiro were hit by catastrophic landslides and flooding. More than 800 people died, more than 50,000 people lost their homes. And the impact of this event made clear that post-disaster response was not enough and highlighted the need to strengthen disaster prevention and preparedness practices nationwide. So in 2012, there were several improvements in the government's approach to disasters. So for instance, the national policy on protection and civil defense, which became the main guideline for all activities related to disaster risk management, and which is supposed to be implemented at all administrative levels. And as part of that, the creation of the Integrated Disaster Information System, which aimed at giving transparency and enabling the systematization of information reported around the country. So basically, it's this online system where data is the information forms are submitted and then compiled in data sets that become available publicly. So this system is also very important for the recognition of situations of emergency and the state of public calamity. These two somehow levels of emergency, they are important because that recognition is part of the process of the transfer of federal resources to states and municipalities affected by a disaster. So the utilization of this system is not only for gathering data, but it's also a precondition for the later for the transfer of funds, of emergency funds to the lower administrative levels. And so in order to report the occurrence of a disaster, the municipalities and states, they must use this standardized disaster information form that compiles all the initial information about the disaster and is then sent to the federal level through the system. And once approved, it is included in the database. So here I wanted to put the form because I think it's interesting to see, how are these things actually done. So here you can see it's in Portuguese, but it gives you an idea there where you see the 6.1. We have all the human damage that can be reported in 7 different categories. So the categories of dislodged and unsheltered, and please bear in mind that this was basically an attempt from our team to translate this like using a term that is closest to the original term, but I know it doesn't sound awesome, but it's the closest translation that we could get to. And you can see there from the definition that they are structured, the concept is structured around the damage to people's houses and their need for temporary shelter, which indicates to us the emergency character of these concepts. although these two categories may in some cases overlap with situations of displacement, they don't encompass exactly the whole displacement cycle and its implications in the long term. So, for instance, if someone is displaced as a consequence of a disaster, but their houses are not affected, or at least not affected enough to generate the need for temporary shelter. So they are generally not going to be accounted for as dislodged or unsheltered, and therefore they would not be identified as a potentially displaced person. So we could actually verify this when we looked specifically at the human damage related to droughts and prolonged droughts. Here we have a dashboard of an overview of the disasters reported as in the category of natural disasters, quote unquote, in 2019. You can see the last chart, which is categories reported under human damage. And you can see the two categories that I mentioned and other affected as being this humongous number that even looks weird trying to do a chart to visualize this data, because the number of other affected is so much higher than everything else. And the other affected is used officially to when the other categories are not sufficient to describe, so they are affected in some other way than the other 6 categories. So if we zoom in to the droughts and prolonged droughts, we'll see that most of the figures reported as other affected are in relation to in the reports of droughts and prolonged droughts. So we could actually this can actually suggest to us a potential challenge in classifying the impact of slow onset disasters in these categories of human damage provided by the disaster information form. So I know I'm running out of time, so I would like to conclude by mentioning some of the main gaps and inconsistencies that we were able to identify during this research and this analysis. So first of all, the fact that the legal framework that was implemented in 2012 does not adopt the concept of displacement itself, and does not account for human mobility in the context of disasters. As a consequence, the data collection system doesn't include a category that adequately captures human mobility. And here it is relevant, I would like to point out that the form that preceded the current disaster information form that I just showed you, it was very similar to the one that we use now, but it did include other things in the human damage section, for instance, some level of age disaggregation, and it also included a category called displaced in the options under human damage. So here you can see in the box number 6, you actually see the third category. That's that would be the word for displaced. And you see the age disaggregation. So after the restructuring in 2012, although we saw great progress in terms of having an integrated system that actually systematizes the data, makes it available through the system made available publicly, it appears that there was a setback in terms of categorization, because the category that actually encompassed human mobility was removed. In the current form, the categories that remain are not adapted to the identification of people displaced by disasters, and having consequences to the possibility of monitoring the evolution of displacement after the disaster, the events strike. We can also mention that the reports with the qualitative data for instance, for their description of other affected. So they have a box to explain other affected, who are these people, how are they affected? They are not made available in the same frequency as the quantitative data. And also the deadline for the local authorities to submit the forms, it varies from 15 to 20 days after the event, and there is no established monitoring procedure to update the information in the system, which represents a big challenge to capture the impacts of slow onset disasters. And so of course, we also see many opportunities for improvement from this, from this analysis that we made in order to optimize the system that is already in place. And I'm just going to mention the main ones, which would be revising the legal framework to incorporate provisions related to displacement, and also incorporate appropriate terms and categories that reflect situations. It reflects the human mobility in this data collection forms. And this cannot only come on paper, but it also requires some capacity building efforts with local authorities regarding methodology, criteria, and concepts in general, and to improve the accuracy of the data that is collected. And that would also need to come with the development of methodologies that actually consider the different timescales and the different impacts of slow onset hazards, which would include a lot of investment in monitoring capacity. So we know that we have observed some changes in the data over time from previous years. So the data set changes a little bit, but not in a sense of, monitoring and updating the figures that were initially submitted in the aftermath of the disaster or in the moment of the report. So we understand that these improvements are essential in the process of making human mobility related to disasters visible in Brazil. And this study was an attempt to set the ground for further investigation. So thank you very much, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts and comments.
Thank you, Louisa. That was fascinating. It's really interesting to see how countries decide to undertake this process and to think about the implications of the approach that a country is taking. This is an admirable effort, but I think, as you alluded to, oftentimes efforts like this lead to more questions than answers. And you did a nice job highlighting the shortcomings. And yeah. And I'm really curious as to what the probability is that some of the improvements you mentioned that would be helpful and necessary. What are the odds that these things are going to happen, and over what kind of timeline?
Definitely. I mean, I'm looking forward to the questions so we can add, to our list of questions that we had once we conducted this analysis. So it's but we can.
And honestly, sorry, you please finish.
No, I said I'm looking forward to discuss. Go ahead.
Excellent. Yes, I have a million questions. I could, for example, the temporary versus permanent, and how does this vary as a function of disaster? How does this compare to other countries? Is there a comparability issue here? It looks like the data are only source data. Do we know where people are going when they're moving? Maybe I'm wrong on that, but again, I think that was really fascinating, and I want to thank you for taking the time to share that with us. I'm sure we'll come back to some interesting questions at the conclusion. So let's move on. Oh, thank you. To Dr. Romola Adiola, who will finish us up with bringing us back to Africa. And Dr. Romola, it is on to you.
Can you see me? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Could you please?
You are now muted. Okay, perfect.
All right. Okay, cool. Awesome. Now, thank you very much for the very kind invitation to the conference. I must say that it's been quite interesting hearing the lectures since morning, and really just sort of been part of this very important discussion at this time. But more importantly as well, sort of reflecting on this crucial subject, one which sort of cuts across various parts of the world, and in fact is also quite topical on the continent. Thank you, Bays, and thank you, Ryan, for this particular session, and a good evening to everyone from South Africa. My conversation for the next couple of minutes is quite different in a sense that it sort of focuses on the law and policy dimensions of the conversation, and with specific reference to Africa. And I must say that we've seen in the regional context, and in fact, the conversations on mobilities in the context of climate change, a level of progression in the law and policy response, while yet the science is evolving. And evidently, the conversation from today sort of spotlights the need for proactive solutions and developing pertinent responses, in part given the fact that there seems to be an emerging narrative for which consensus is yet to be acquired on climate change and its link to the migration discourse in much more specific terms. And I not really want to rehash what has already been said by the excellent speakers earlier this morning on the law and policy dimension of the conversation from a global perspective. However, I would like to really focus the narrative on the regional context and really just sort of reflect on how frameworks are being used in the conversation on policy, on climate change and migration within the regional context. And maybe just to sort of as a starting point in the conversation, what we've seen is there are actually three pertinent dimensions of this across the continent. The first is in relation to migration. And at present, there is a migration policy framework for Africa and plan of action, which runs from 2018 to 2030, and specifically actually recognizes climate change as a root cause of migration, recommending strategic action and development of migration and climate migration policies by states. So this policy really, at the time, being revised when there were conversations around climate change, migration, development of, a pertinent framework on this issue, and a regional strategy in addressing the dimensions of climate change in actual fact. There are also ongoing discussions on using free movement processes within various contexts for the furtherance of protection. And this is really an area where much of the entry points on the law and its intersection with migration within the context of climate change has also been quite prominent, and also against the backdrop of the regional free movement protocol, which was adopted in 2018. And significantly in East Africa, there is a free movement protocol that specifically incorporates protection. Now, this is in the context of the Intergovernmental Agency on Development. And it's significant because you have most of the countries often cited in reports in the narrative on climate migration in Africa within that particular regional bloc. And the fact that the protocol within that context sort of recognizes disasters linked to climate change also tends to give a significant momentum to the conversation around developing pragmatic solutions from a law and policy dimension. The second dimension of the conversation is in relation to refugee protection. And I think we've heard variously today that the global framework as it stands is quite limited, given the fact that the grounds on which it provides protection are specific. And this is in relation to race, religion, nationality, membership of a specific particular social group, and political opinion. However, the regional refugee framework has an expanded refugee definition. And this is really going back to the 1969 OU Refugee Convention, which was developed as a regional response at the time to the 1951 UN Convention, which had a dateline limit and a geographic scope at the time prior to the adoption of the 1967 protocol. And within this regional context, within the regional context, the expanded definition sort of provides that refugees are also persons who are affected by various situations, so external aggression, issues of occupation, foreign domination, or events seriously disturbing public order. And there's been a level of conversation within the region. For instance, in 2019, there was a roundtable on forced migration. And within this context, there was a significant outcome that the regional refugee framework may allow decision makers to recognize specifically refugee status in the context of climate change. And this was quite notable because this was reflected in a document that was in fact produced by discussions from member states of the African Union, as with various international agencies and stakeholders at the time. But then the convention does not specifically provide how that could, apply. Of course, if you look at the definition of who a refugee is, this expanded definition, it's not also very clear how we could fit that within the context. But the fact that at the regional level, there's a lot of drive towards, actually we can use that framework to protect persons who are displaced, pretty much taking a humanitarian outlook to the conversation is quite notable. But of course, in terms of the interpretation of that, the conversation on public order is sort of mostly linked to violence and conflict. So we see that the current interpretations also stress very strongly the climate conflict nexus and do not actually provide for climate change as an event that could lead to refugee status specifically. So that there's been that conversation as to how to then make climate change much more concretely fit within that context as a specific cause, which of course links back to the need for evidence on that particular idea. But in terms of internal displacement, this is where the law and policy narrative has been mostly elaborate. And as Dr. Kumari earlier had mentioned, this is really in the context of the African Union Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons in Africa, which is also known as the Kampala Convention. And specifically, the instrument mandates states to protect persons displaced by natural disasters, including climate change. And this is in Article 5.4 of the instrument. But then there's a pertinent question about the extent to which these norms tend to find expression within the national context. And I'll say that there is at present a significant need for synergy in that regard, because what you find is a progressive regional law and policy landscape with a few actions at the national level. But of course, particularly in the context of internal displacement, we're seeing some level of significant progress. For instance, Somalia has an elaborate federal policy that incorporates climate change, which was adopted late last year. Also in South Sudan, there's a draft legislation on internal displacement, which also incorporates climate change, and that is yet to be adopted, but it's quite notable because it specifically incorporates the innovations of the Kampala Convention in recognizing climate change as a root cause of internal displacement. And in the Somali region of Ethiopia, there is also a durable solutions framework, which incorporates protection for persons displaced by climate change. And it's interesting because the framework actually was adopted in 2017 and I think comes to an end this year. And last year, the Ethiopian government adopted a durable solutions initiative. But evidently, these are a few countries where, compared to the number of states that have actually ratified the Kampala Convention, which is actually now 31 states, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, more states are still ratifying and would ratify the convention in the coming years. But overall, what we see is a progressive conversation on law and policy with a need for more evidence on the causality across the various countries, drawing significantly on the participation of affected populations. And this is really crucial, especially in driving the momentum for states, because often in conversations, and I recall last year, I was in a country trying to help out in developing national action plan for the Human Rights Commission on the protection of persons in the context of internal displacement, but specifically also in the context of climate change. And really what drove this narrative was the cyclone Idai, and the fact that for the the commission, they wanted to do something about it. But then there was this question around, okay, so how do we draw on this causality? So is climate change really the one exacerbating this? And how do we sort of reflect on that evidence? And how do we then provide actual protection? But then also, how do we also convince our leaders? And how do we sort of draw that relationship in the silos, legal silos, in terms of climate change strategies, displacement solutions, and migration law and policy formations? And so, and I suppose this is also something that really comes up in the conversation today around the need for evidence in driving solutions to the problem. So I'll really stop here for now. I see I'm just in time, but I look forward to further questions that we may have in this regard and conversations on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for sharing your expertise on this topic. I think it really added to the panel and gives us a more complete, holistic treatment of this issue in Africa. The importance of the legal status of migrants and refugees can't be understated, particularly within the context of planning and policy. You lay out the importance of a cohesive regional approach to the question, a regional / international approach to the question of status and protection, mentioning the Kampala Convention, and the importance of its applicability to both internal and international migrants. And of course, referencing the importance of the climate conflict nexus and clarifying some of these issues within the context of status, I think is really important. So that is the conclusion of our presentations. Bias, are we moving on to the Q&A portion at this point?
Yes, you have 4 questions. You can address them. Thank you. In the Q&A, yeah.
Okay, I'm looking now. Do you want me to pick these, or are you going to go ahead and do it? I have.
Okay, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll do it. Okay, so let's see. Bias, you have a question here, I think that you've indicated. Is this, oh, this is from earlier. Okay, so let's see. Okay, first question is for Dr. Jimena. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. Do you have any policy recommendations for the Pacific?
Well, in the case of the Pacific and in the different regions, I think policies on environmental migration have to start at the village level, at the local level. It is very important to listen to the people's voices. Then I think it's important to contextualize migration drivers from the point of view of the people in their own social and geographical context. I think in my experience working in the Pacific, it is necessary a synergy of different knowledge systems in both research and policy. I think that traditional knowledge has to be integrated into climate change adaptation policies. I think it's important to acknowledge different voices. The voices of elders, women, youth are important. And at the national, regional, and global levels, I think the topic of climate change and migration should be incorporated both in sectoral and development policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question for Louisa. This is a very interesting question. Since fire clearances in the Amazon area are often claimed to be natural, are there victims included in the natural disaster category, to the best of your knowledge?
Thank you. Yes, this is indeed a very interesting question. So talking from the, the setup of the system itself and how this data is collected, it uses in the form when they have to add what disaster happened, they can only add one type, right? In the format of this form, and it's based on the Brazilian codification and classification of disasters. So what do we have in this classification? We have a group of disaster types, disaster codes that are under natural, and then we have technological. We only have these two categories. And so forest fires are under the so-called natural disasters, and then you have two different types. So forest fires in protected areas and forest fires in unprotected areas. There is, talking about the qualitative data, there is a box below the specification of the disaster where there can be a description, more detailed description of what happened. And you know, we know not from this data, but you know, from investigative journalism and other sources, that a lot of the fires that happen in the Amazon might not really fall only in the natural disaster category. But if you look at the, you know, the data that would then come out of the system using this codification, it would probably appear, in my understanding, under the natural disaster category because of how the categorization is structured. Yes, so I hope that somehow answers your question.
That's very helpful. Thank you. That's very interesting. Next question for Romola. Do you know if there has been any case that triggered the public disorder caused to request asylum for climate reasons?
Thank you very much for that pertinent question. Very much appreciated. So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's been one of the conversations in more recent times about trying to find a specific case where that has been mentioned. And particularly I know that places where often we tend to look for those kinds of jurisprudence are either in the Horn of African region. So for instance, with the Kenyan courts, or even in South Africa, with the fact that there's there's a significant jurisprudence and robust jurisprudence coming from the constitutional courts. But as of yet, what we've not actually seen an actual case where the courts have actually had to interpret the language of the Kampala Convention, of the OU Refugee Convention, rather, in relation to climate change. Of course, this is something that would probably come up in the coming months or years, given the fact that this is an issue, especially in various parts of the continent, not least, of course, the Horn of African region, with more cases of the nexus being drawn. But what we've seen is much of the conversation being from an analytical perspective, as against being from the case law perspective. Then there's a very interesting scenario recalled that was documented some time back, where there were movements from the Somali region into Kenya. And these movements were actually driven by populations moving due to the conflict climate nexus. But of course, given the fact that the expanded definition of the OU Refugee Convention also allows for situations where persons fleeing conflict could move, it was more, the status was more in relation to conflict than it was in relation to climate change. But of course, the fact that those populations where there was a mixed movement in that context was quite significant. But in terms of an actual jurisprudence, that is yet to be seen. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. We do have one other question here that I'm going to ask everybody to address, but prior to that, I'm actually, if I may, I'm going to address a question to Dr. Musonda. And quite simply, I want to ask, what can data scientists do to better assist you in your mission and to better aid you in your objectives vis-a-vis adaptation and mitigation within the context of climate-induced migration in the Sahel, for example?
Well, thank you so much for that question, actually, Dr. Jones. You know, what's interesting is today I had a meeting with part of the team within our agency that's looking at, we've gone through a process of review of our internal programming, and also because member states request us that we prepare a midterm strategy. Now, it's the first time that within our agency, we're actually having a whole cluster on the digital ecosystem. And it's within this digital ecosystem that we're looking at things such as, artificial intelligence, fintech, we're looking at envirotech, we're looking at all these different elements of data. In fact, one of the, and also the, back to Ramola's point, it's also the issue of, the credibility around the legal system. What does it actually mean, this accessibility to data? What are people giving out, or the information that we're using to be able to make informed and transformational decisions. So for us, the data is fundamental. But also what's interesting, so we were speaking with a colleague from an AI center here in Nairobi, which was very fascinating because we're talking about climate anxiety, but and tomorrow is World Mental Health Day. And he was just telling us that, kids, young people, youth, like to see data put in such a sexy and informative way. They just don't want it to be boring. And they want to figure out how that relates to their lives and how they can make a decision based on the look and feel of this data. And so for us, we work like with the Internet of Elephants, for example, who are into gaming and really talking about, how do you look at elephant data, for example, or migratory species data in relation to communities or in relation to the pastoral communities. So they're trying to work with Maasai communities. And then just putting it in a gaming way, because young people will be more kind of in tune and try and be part of that system and decision-making process. Oh, this is how this works. This is why the Maasai go into the Masai Mara and Serengeti system at specific times, et cetera, and all of that. It's all data, but it's just been so collected so wonderfully and curated very well for that element of transformation. So that's what we're also trying to do. And I think what this pandemic has also taught us is that, how we've presented, I don't know how many people are sitting in this event, but I'm sure that the majority of people here may not even have heard of UNAV. But because we're also presenting a lot of our work around zoonosis and talking in different events like this one, people are kind of curious, like, oh, so what does this agency do? We are the only agency within the United Nations system that talks about environment. So how do we harness those elements of data to talk about these environmental dynamics and shifts and changes? Exactly what colleagues Luisa and Jimena and Ramola were talking about. So that is for us a really fundamental way forward as we go, and we know that we're in the middle of a planetary emergency. So how do we use the right data to begin to emerge out of that?
That's really fascinating and exciting to hear how much you're engaging with folks in the data science community that really are on the cutting edge. And there's something that's almost inherently Socratic to the way you spoke about using gaming as a form of engagement, right? You're allowing young people to almost learn as they go. It really is fascinating and encouraging to hear. So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Bias, are we just about out of time? Where do we stand?
Yes, if you are done, then I can go for the closing remarks, but you can take 5 more minutes. Yes.
Okay. I did see the last question there, and I did want to give each of the panelists a moment to share some closing thoughts, and perhaps they could each do so within the context of that last question. But feel free to deviate if you have thoughts you would like to share. But the last question did relate to the media and how the media portrays folks that are impacted by this particular issue. And I believe it read, how can the media do a better job to more accurately and more treat populations that are the most impacted with a bit more sensitivity? And if the panelists don't mind, I'd actually like to take a stab at this first, speaking in regards to the situation where I am here in the United States, where the media really tends to, and there have been efforts to change this, but historically treat these the climate migration phenomena in a really cursory way, without really getting into any of the great detail related to the how, the why, the degree to which migration itself is an adaptation response, and instead tends to sensationalize and frame the issue within the context of the political atmosphere in the country as it stands now, which regarding immigration is one of, in my opinion, manufactured alarm. And the reality is the United States has and remains a nation of immigrants, and one that will rely on immigrants for its own economic well-being going forward. And I do believe it's imperative that the media treat this issue more responsibly. Work I did recently with the New York Times related to the Central American migration case, it was an attempt to do so, but there's always a bit of hesitation to share information regarding the potential scale of migration for fear it will be seized upon by those with political interests that may be detrimental to the most impacted populations. So I do hope the media are able to engage more with scientists and practitioners who work on this issue. And maybe it's imperative that we actually do more to reach out to the media and be involved in trying to change the narrative. I'd like to open the floor to the panelists to share either a response to that question or other concluding thoughts. And let's just go in the order for ease of logistically, the order that we presented in. So we'll start with Dr. Musanda.
Well, thank you so much. I'll be very quick about it. I mean, what I must say is for us as an agency, we've been absolutely deliberate to actually do media trainings for a lot of environmental journalists, not just across Africa, but around the world, to really talk about how the reporting is done, you know, the stories. And I don't know if anyone has read the book by Solitaire Townsend, which is a fantastic book. She's an English woman, and I interviewed her here when we had one of the high-level panels at the UN Environment Assembly. And she really talks about the urgency and importance of being hopeful. Because a lot of the media stories, I mean, the story that Romola was talking about in Mozambique, we had such problems. I mean, here was 2 consecutive, disasters hitting Mozambique. And then all of you can see is a picture of a woman on top of a tree. And like, really, can we talk about what people are actually doing and how the recovery process is happening and really talk about, be a little bit more hopeful. And I think this has also come a lot in the mental health element in relation to what you were talking about North America, a lot about, you know, the moment the media really kind of courts presenting and sharing a lot of the negative stories, the more young people are actually even more suicidal. And there's also all these studies that are emerging because there's while we're living anyway, this earth is gone now, it's coming to an end and this is a disaster, etc. But I think we need more hopeful messages and really thinking through that. And I liked you know, Dr. Jimena's message about, you know, engaging communities and hearing the stories and what's their narrative and all of that. That is so absolutely necessary. And thank you as well for having me again on the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jimena.
Well, first, thank you very much. Excellent panel, moderator, and excellent presentations. So, as regards the alarming headlines about mass migration, I think there is more awareness now on how to communicate climate change and climate change related migration. Some people said that these alarming statements are well intentioned because their aim is to raise awareness, motivate responses or humanitarian action. But I think, at least in the case of the Pacific Island countries and other regions, I think people are fighting to be listened to. They are demanding to amplify their voices so they can be part of the solutions. So another point I want to mention very quickly is gender. I think climate change is not gender neutral. I think vulnerabilities of men and women to climate change tend to differ, reflecting men's and women's socially and cultural defined roles and responsibilities. In the Pacific region, for example, the division of labor has been traditionally based on rank, gender, and age. So migration and economic social needs have contributed to the modification of those patterns. I think these changes in roles have also affect the way men and women respond to the impacts of climate change. So I think it's important to consider the role of gender issues and climate mobility. Thank you very much for having me.
Great, thank you, and thank you for bringing up the gender dimension. We hadn't spoken much about it during this panel, but certainly an important one. Luisa.
Thank you. I think I agree very much with my colleagues, my panel colleagues, and I would also highlight that I think the media and journalists, they often are present in contexts, in situations where the academics are not or are not yet, right? So they have the opportunity of hearing the stories and hearing and portraying the perspective, the strategies, the knowledge of the affected populations. And so I think some sort of commitment to giving the stage for those perspectives, as well as Musonda said, in the more positive aspect, or kind of highlighting their knowledge and their strategies and what they think about it. And also very important, I think, in the post-disaster, in the follow-up, because after the whole rush about a specific, especially on sudden events, after the whole rush is gone, the affected populations often they lose visibility. And that sometimes, when we are trying to investigate certain disasters in Brazil, we run out of official sources, and then we end up with the media sources to kind of see, oh, what's going on there? Where are these people now? What's going on? So I think that there's a very important role to play. And if, as you said, with a lot of responsibility and commitment, we can get a lot from their work as well. And thank you so much. It was very, very nice to share the panel with all of you.
Excellent, thank you. And again, each one of you continues to add another dimension to this conversation. So I appreciate that. The time dimension in terms of what happens when all the bright lights are gone to affected populations, extremely important. And we will now turn to Romola.
Thank you very much for that point that was raised around the media. But thank you so much for Dr. Bryan for the excellent moderation of the panel, and to my co-panelists and Dr. Musonda for that pertinent point you raised around the need for engagement with the media. And I think I share the sentiment and that has been said by the excellent panelist on this particular point around the need for more engagement with the media, and in fact, the need to sort of foster a form of collaboration. I think something that just came to mind while I was just thinking about that question was something that happened during the COVID, the beginning of the COVID situation here in South Africa, where one of the media outlets had actually reached out to the university and to say, could you kindly give us an analytical piece on how this particular situation is affecting this group of people, so migrants within the context of the society. And I think that's a very interesting way of actually having a form of interaction on that point. And it has to be both ways in the context of the fact that, I think there's a need for those in the academic circles as well to sort of develop a form of partnership agreement. And I say partnership agreements because I just remembered something that occurred in 2019. And this was between a research think tank and Al Jazeera at the time around news in relation to forcibly displaced populations, which is quite innovative and very interesting. And I think that having those kinds of agreements would be useful in sort of ensuring that we can also influence the narrative in the media, especially given the fact that what we see is the academia having a lot of interesting perspective and a lot of research, and the media also having that skill of analysis and journalism, but of course needing a bit more information coming from the academia. So thank you very much for that excellent question, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel.
Great, thank you, Romola. And again, thank you for giving us yet another dimension to consider. And through the example you share, addressing this question within the context of COVID and through the media, which is particularly powerfully poised to do so. I just want to take a few seconds to thank the panelists. You all did a wonderful job. Your presentations were excellent. And I want to thank you for your contributions and making my job really easy. This was extremely enjoyable. I want to thank Bias for the invitation to be here and to moderate this panel. And to all the participants, those who asked questions, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Dr. Bias, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Brian and the panelists. It was really interesting and timely. Just a moment. Okay, so yes, it is time to wrap up today's webinar, but yes, we talked a lot about forced migration, and in that case, I am going to force you to watch a short video. It's just for 2 minutes, and after that, I will talk about the way forward. Okay. I hope you can watch it.
I am sorry that there are people who are in power internationally, notably, of course, the United States, but also in Australia, which is extraordinary, actually, because Australia is already facing having to deal with some of the most extreme manifestations of climate change. Nobody thought that human beings would change the climate. And we now know we are. And what is worse, of course, is that we are changing the climate in a way that's irreversible. If the world climate change goes on as it is, we are going to be facing huge problems with immigration. Large parts of Africa will become even less inhabitable than they are now. We cannot be radical enough in dealing with the issues that face us at the moment. I have no idea what the future holds. I see no future in being pessimistic, because that leads you to say, then to hold it, why should I care? And I believe that way disaster lies. So I feel an obligation. It's the only way you can get up in the morning is to believe that actually we can do something about it.
Yes, and thank you all. It was a short video from Sir David Attenborough. So it talked about how climate change might impact the immigration system in Western countries. So this is very important. We didn't talk much about it, but that might be the future area to explore. And yes, from the morning until now, we had total 4 sessions. Panel 1, there was a short introduction from Bina Desai at IDMC about overall disaster displacement at a global scale, followed by case studies from South Asian country in Bangladesh. And we had in conversation with Professor Ilan Kelman, followed by we had Dr. Kanta Kumari from the World Bank, and now we invited speakers from different continents in Africa, Latin America, and also from the Pacific Islands. It was really very insightful and thoughtful for us, and I believe it would produce some food for thought for how climate change might impact migration and human mobility. So what would be our next step? Yes, of course, we talked a lot about climate change and migration from our perspective, but we must think about the victims, like the vulnerable communities who are really facing the natural disasters and impact of anthropogenic climate change. It is time to act for them. It's already been discussed by Professor Salimul Haq. And how can we do it? And from our UCL as a department, what we are planning to do now to produce a policy brief based on today's webinar. And I involve all the speakers and panelists, and of course, the questions we had almost around 73 questions from our participants. We will incorporate all of them, the answers, the talks, and try to produce some policy briefs that we will try to promote in the IDMC Global Report, and also for the upcoming COP26 to be held in Glasgow next year. That's all from my side. I really want to thank again all the panelists, the journalists, participants, and also UCL IRDR admin and Miles Harris and Shaw for co-hosting today's webinar. And please feel free to email us anytime. You can email me or I had the inquiries and about anything, how we can move forward and collaborate together in a meaningful way that really might be helpful for the vulnerable communities. That should be the ultimate goal, rather than publishing articles, writing. Yes, those are important, and writing media blogs. And thank you so much again. I want to close it here.